Okay,
All
I
right,
think we're
so I
ready to
do
go, Karen.
have I do have 11:30. Thanks, Suzanne. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this morning. My name is Karen Buckley. I am in the Member Services and Marketing Department at NYMER. This is a free webinar for our NYMER members. And thank you so much for taking the time when we're hinging on lunch hour to participate with NYMER, Suzanne Laughlin, and Crisis Risk in this important webinar this morning or today. As public officials and a public entity, your decisions and actions during and after a crisis can really make a difference. We like to call it consequences management instead of crisis management. And I want to remind you that NYMER does provide a free service that can coach and assist you in your responses and during the event or after the event. And this event does not have to be a covered claim with NYMER. And we partner with CrisisRisk in order to provide that service for you. I will make sure that you all have that information. If you don't already, you can let me know. My contact information will be provided at the end of the webinar. Thank you very much to Suzanne Laughlin for presenting on this very important topic today. I'm going to introduce Suzanne, who is co-founder and general counsel of CrisisRisk. It's a crisis management firm whose principals have handled hundreds of crises, which include some of our nation's most catastrophic events. Since Suzanne and CrisisRisk's roots are in the insurance industry, they provide a combination of legal and crisis expertise that is very unique. That combination really positions CrisisRisk to make a difference when your municipality has a serious incident or event. NYMER's philosophy that risk management is effective in reducing loss ties in perfectly with our partnership with CrisisRisk. So with no further ado, I want to introduce and thank Suzanne Laughlin for presenting on this important topic today.
Thanks, Karen, and thank you everybody for joining. I didn't realize, I guess that we are the only thing that stands between you and lunch, so sorry about that. As Karen said, I personally have spent most of my career in the insurance industry. I was a litigator for many years doing insurance defense work when I got out of law school several decades ago, and then worked in-house for an insurance company where I was very involved with both the defense and the claims. 15 years ago, we started another crisis management firm that we had actually sold 2 years ago and now formed CrisisRisk. But for the total of 15 years, we've been strictly focused on helping clients, both in the public and private sector, identify the types of threats that they're vulnerable to and make sure that they can put strategies and procedures in place that will help them ideally prevent the bad thing from happening, but where that's not possible, make sure they can mitigate and come out the other side of the event with the least amount of impact to what we refer to as critical assets, which is our people, our brand, our reputation. So that's the backdrop for who we are. People often are curious what kind of events we've handled. People will say, well, do you work in any one industry or do you work with any particular type of threat? And although there are certainly concentrations because certain types of events tend to happen more than others, we work really across all industries. And what everybody has in common is that they employ or service human beings. And unfortunately, they're both our greatest asset and our greatest liability at times. So this screen shows just the array of different things we've been involved with. I know that we don't have the mic open, and if we did, what I often get when I'm asked in a seminar environment or presentation environment is, I don't really understand cannibalism. How on earth did you get involved with cannibalism? And that itself would require really a separate webinar, but I could tell you that that is in fact something we handled. It took place at a university, and crisis management lessons learned, crisis traps. If there was ever a situation we were involved in that evidenced every single pitfall imaginable, it was that one. But fortunately, what I usually say is that if you haven't heard of it, then we know we were effective. So today we're going to try to really answer some questions that you may have and that others have had. Can a crisis be prevented? And the answer is absolutely. What are the common crisis traps that people walk into? How do your actions, your decisions, your words influence the outcomes? And by the end, we hope you're going to be better prepared to understand the type of infrastructure you should have in place, including decisions, actions, words that are needed. And also, we're going to give you a tool that will give you the ability to measure whether an event is escalating or de-escalating. And that becomes critical because your future actions that you need to take really will hinge on how well you're performing. And often, people don't really know. So we're going to talk to you about that. Before I go any further, though, I want to point out that there's a question feature on the dashboard that you should be seeing. So we will take questions, if not throughout, and we're certainly happy to break if there's a question that relates to something very specific we just covered, or alternatively at the end. And in a worst case, if we don't get to your questions, we will follow up with you to make sure that you get your answers, okay? So, of course, bad things happen. We have everything from fires to allegations of excessive force, racial discrimination, sexual harassment. I mean, these are just a few. And as public officials, you all can really make a difference as to whether a bad thing, an incident, becomes a crisis. But how effective you'll be in accomplishing that will hinge on how prepared you are, and again, what you do immediately in the aftermath of what occurred. So I'd like to start with a little bit of definitions, because these words on the screen mean different things to different people. And in particular, the word emergency and the word crisis are often interchanged. So I just want to take a couple of minutes to go through each one of these so that at least you'll understand when I use them what I'm referring to. So critical assets is really what crisis management's about. It's all the things that you're responsible for protecting in your role. It's your people, your brand, your reputation, finances, property, all of it. There are certainly more. It could be intellectual property. And then you have the threats. These are a person or thing that can harm a critical asset. So in your realm, it could range from all of the things and dozens more that are not on here. These are really representative. I did highlight the communicable illness outbreak in particular because this is a real life scenario that I know is top of mind for everyone, and I'm guessing that this is really the opportunity you're all realizing to start preparing. And how bad it'll be, when it'll get here, those are all questions that we don't know. Pretty fair to say that it's something that you can count on having to deal with at some point down the road. So the vulnerability, how vulnerable you are to a threat, is really based on whether you have weaknesses or gaps in your ability to respond. The risk that results from it is the potential loss or damage that results from a threat exploiting a vulnerability. So I'll use an example. If you have two houses on the coast in Florida and there's a hurricane, one house has hurricane shutters, one does not. The risk to the house without the shutters is greater than the one with, because the threat, the hurricane, it's exploiting the vulnerability. So what's the vulnerability? The lack of shutters. So you can use this, concept when you think about just about any type of threat or risk. The event itself is when the threat has actually materialized. Now, is that event a crisis? Not yet. And I'm going to, I know I get challenged on this regularly. I'll tell people no matter how catastrophic something is, there is a way to handle it in a way that it does not become a crisis. So let's also talk about emergency. An event becomes an emergency when there's a dangerous situation that threatens life safety. So when I use the term crisis for purposes of this session, I am not talking about an emergency. How you handle an emergency could absolutely turn into a crisis. But when we use the word crisis, we're not referring to any type of life safety event. So hopefully that is helpful for this discussion. So this is our definition of a crisis. An event becomes a crisis when the organizational response fails to prevent severe impacts to critical organizational assets, and there is an extensive negative reaction. So I'm going to say that one more time. It becomes a crisis when the organizational response fails to prevent severe impacts to critical assets, and there's a negative reaction. We're going to talk about that negative reaction, and that's really where the crisis traps come in, and the topic for this webinar. So, quickly, what do we know about crisis? That it can come from something that's known or unknown by way of risk. By its very nature, it thrives on the lack of structure. It forces everyone into a reactionary mode. And usually when we're in a crisis mode, when your heart's beating out of your chest because of something terrible that's just happened, you're being asked to make decisions based on incomplete information. And depending on how severe the event is, people get tired, and fatigue leads to a deterioration in our decision making. There's always intense scrutiny, meaning someone's watching. In your case, as public entities, you have countless numbers of stakeholders, and people are paying attention. And the consequences, Karen, mentioned in the beginning of the webinar that the term consequence management is really what this is about. The crisis itself is very short-lived. It might be a 24, 48-hour type of event, but what you do in those 24, 48 hours is really going to determine whether you become defined by what occurred. So the consequences that flow from the event really are dictated by your actions in that immediate aftermath. Another indication, command and control may be lost. Communications tend to be poorly drafted because they're usually not prepared in advance. I mean, imagine what you could do and how clear of thought you would be if you could today craft the messaging you'd like to use if, for example, a police department was accused of using excessive force, or one of your executives was accused of sexual harassment. Imagine how much better you would be able to write whatever it is you need to write if you could do it today without the pressure of the real event. So, and of course, there's always hostile agents. You've got the press, there may be regulators. So crisis response really comes down to leadership. And again, this is redundant, I know, but decisions, actions, and words. How you respond is going to determine, even if it's a catastrophic event, whether they'll become a crisis. We handled a mass shooting event last year that the municipality acted so quickly and brought resources in as rapidly as possible and started attending to all of the stakeholders' needs in a way that the public felt cared for, the victims felt cared for, and we're going to talk more about that. And that's how you can take even a catastrophic event and not have it turn into a crisis. Unfortunately, what you see here on the screen talks about late notice. Late notice is an insurance term, right? So late notice is what insurance companies might use to say, well, we're not going to respond to your claim, or why did you give us such late notice? This is something that happened a week ago or 2 weeks ago or a month ago. And often we hear, if I'd only known, I would have done something differently. I would have taken different action. I would have said something different. These are the words of remorse that we have heard more public officials utter in the aftermath of either a press conference that wasn't well thought out, a town meeting that wasn't well thought out, a statement they gave a reporter in a reactionary way that wasn't well thought out. They were acting impulsive. And in a crisis, one of the most important things to understand is that you actually do have more time than you think. And you can always apologize for being late to issue some type of a statement, but you can't apologize for being wrong. So this concept of late notice is something that really NYMER and Markel, who's the reinsurer, and CrisisRisk together all wanted to see if we could find a way to address. And the way we've done that, and to the credit of NYMER and the service they're offering, I'm going to introduce this term circumstance. This is a term we use to describe an occurrence or an action or words that may lead to a crisis. So a simple example would be in a workplace violence scenario. Let's just say you terminate an employee, and that person, either in the heat of the moment or even hours, days later, posts something that I'm going to get even with my boss. So that's a threat. And if we're paying attention, we're on top of things like that. That's what we would call a circumstance. That's where we would say, okay, you've had a threat made. Do you know how to handle this? Are you prepared to intervene with whatever actions are needed to prevent this from actually occurring, that this person who may be on a path to violence, like how do we assess that? How do we know if it was some off-the-cuff comment or this person could really be a threat to our organization? So a circumstance is any type of situation that's out of the norm where you feel threatened and you may need some extra help. And what NYMER has done through its relationship with us, with CrisisRisk, is made a hotline number available to all of you that can be used 24/7. And Karen will share more about that when you reach out to her. But in other words, we want you to call us before something happens. And circumstance gives you that opportunity. So let's talk about a little bit about, and I'm going to pause for a minute just to see, Karen, if we had any questions yet, and I don't see anything yet. So
no, I don't see any, Suzanne.
Okay, so perfect. I'm going to keep going and talk about, so how can we know if we have the opportunity to detect a circumstance? So in this day and age, everyone is monitoring in different ways. And I imagine, depending on the resources you each have available, and I realize you're all different. You may be different, have different sizes. You may have full-time people that perform a function or part-time people that perform a function. But here are some of the ways that we can become aware of an event or circumstance that has the potential to become a crisis. So let's use personal observations. People hear and see things every single day. Let's use domestic violence. Domestic violence is the leading cause of the death of women in the workplace. People who are victims of domestic violence exhibit certain behaviors, or there may be environmental situations that are occurring. You may understand that a spouse is ringing the phone of your employee 20, 30, 40 times a day. That's not normal behavior. You may see the employee come in with some type of an injury or a bruise. In other words, people typically see things that aren't normal. Most people are reluctant to speak up because they're afraid of a bunch of things. One, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Mary's husband isn't abusing her. Or what if I report it and then Mary's husband comes after me? So you'll see on the top this anonymous reporting. We feel anonymous reporting is a vital tool to any crisis prevention program. Anonymous reporting means I've given all of my employees or stakeholders the ability to report something truly anonymously. Email doesn't do it. Phone calls usually don't do it. People don't feel that's anonymous. There are encrypted texting capabilities. There are applications that are out there. So there are ways for you to structure an anonymous reporting protocol or program within your organization. And the equally important part of that is that there has to be somebody on the receiving end of those reports, whether that's they tie into a police department or some security person or human resources. The key, though, is that there be somebody charged with the 24/7 responsibility of monitoring the reports you get. And that, of course, then gives you the ability to take action. Background checks, I mean, often people who are problems from the start. They're usually problems before they even get to your employee. So background checks are very important. It's important that you have the ability to update background checks if you notice that behaviors change. Performance reviews. Believe it or not, there are people who never get performance reviews. It's a source of real anger for some employees, where they feel they're either not validated or they don't have any worth to the company. If you have, for example, someone who makes a discrimination claim and they don't feel that you've attended to it quickly enough. So people exhibit behaviors that will give you cues. But performance reviews are a very important part of just a healthy workplace, and you learn a lot about people in the process. Monitoring social media is vital. I hope you're all, even if you're using Google Alerts and keeping track of mentions that are made. If you do have an employee that is of particular concern, or another individual, you have the ability to actually do more directed research into their social media channels. There are firms out there that can help you do that kind of research. For those of you who have police departments, they typically have skills that can be of assistance. And finally, investigations. When something happens, you have to look into it. And we'll talk a little bit about one of the crisis traps related to investigations in just a couple minutes. So the key really is recognizing an event that could present some type of a threat, identifying, is it likely to? Is it what would the threat level be? Is this something I need to act on now? Is this something that I can just report, to someone else and they'll look into it? So the alerting function is vital. Again, back to anonymous reporting, with adults in particular, you're more likely to get people to alert you as to the problems they're seeing or the concerns they have if they can do so anonymously. Put this picture here of the meerkat, which is quite an interesting animal, because these are animals that are always scanning for danger. When their pups are playing or when they're foraging for food, somebody's in charge of watching out for the danger. And when they see an eagle flying too low, they scream. Somebody screams. It's really like that. Pay attention to the warning signs of danger, identify them, and alert someone that you can then take the kind of action that's needed. So one of the other questions we get a lot is, well, how do you know when an event has become a crisis? And this is a tool we've developed. We call it the ABCs of crisis. We know historically from handling these events, hundreds of events over the last 15 years, that events that trigger these particular negative reactions are more likely to become a crisis. Anger, blame, concern. So, for example, you'll hear the word outrage a lot. We were outraged by what the mayor did. We were outraged by the actions of this police officer. The outrage or anger, the more people who are outraged or angry, the more likely you are going to have a crisis. Blame, if they're saying you're responsible for something, if they're pointing fingers, that's another indicator. You don't have to have all three of these. Concern could be fear. For example, we'll use the Flint, Michigan water issue. When you have the public that's concerned about whether the water they're drinking is killing them, you can rest assured there's an awful lot of concern. There's fear. Is there blame? Absolutely. Are people angry? Absolutely. So once you understand that these emotions have been triggered, then let's look at the next step. Okay, how many people are angry? Is it one person who's angry? Is it 10 people? Is it 100 people? The number of people who are angry, how quickly something is spreading or the spread, the actual reach of how many people are impacted will correlate to whether or not something has the potential to become a crisis. How quickly the consequences flow from that, the speed at which the negative consequences start to happen, whether that be the media picking up on something, how quickly more media pick up on it. Does it trigger, for example, a public response? Is there rioting or picketing or whatever? So, and then the setting, what's the setting for where is it occurring? What's the context? So, for example, I live in Sullivan County. If something happens and it's in our local paper, that's one thing. If the event is reported in the New York Times, that's another. I will say with caution, though, that what we see now, obviously with social media, everything's public instantly. And as you know, it's not local anymore because it's on the internet. So you'll often see resharing of news stories, even those that are local, if they have the right ingredients. And again, what are those ingredients? Anger, blame, concern. The media loves controversy. The more a story has that includes these types of reactions, the more likely it is to pick up interest in a broader media base. So what do? How do we manage a crisis? Command and control is very, very important. And we have a saying, every crisis needs a general. So who's leading the response? Ideally, you would want to know who that is before the event occurs. So if you have not yet structured a crisis management team, we really recommend that you do that. And we always recommend that it be a multidisciplinary team. And I'll give you the results of the survey at the end. The questions there were 2 questions we posed to all of you before when you registered. But we were curious to understand really the type of infrastructure you have. So I know it was like a long run-on sentence in a question. But the key really is that we want to know who is in control, who is going to make decisions. And again, someone needs to be in charge, someone needs to be the general. We need a team of people that not only are responding, but they also recognize that as part of that response, they're constantly reassessing the risks that are arising in the aftermath. So risk isn't just something you think about before something happens. Once it happens, there are new risks that flow from the scenario. Hopefully you have plans or playbooks or scripts or checklists or something that helps guide you in your decision making once something occurs. And the reason for that is not that each of you isn't capable of recognizing a situation and using your intellect, your experience. And 9 times out of 10, you'll probably do a really good job. But every now and then a situation arises where there may be an unusual stakeholder group, or maybe you have a key contract, a key relationship, something that if you overlook could lead to a very bad situation for your entity. So having a checklist, having something that identifies your stakeholders and understanding what would the issues be for those stakeholder groups, our employees, the public, the people we serve, is very important. So the value of the playbook is that someone can sit in a room with your crisis team and make sure that before everybody leaves the room and they understand their marching orders and they're ready to go out and implement, that someone says, hey, wait a second, we forgot to talk about this very important point or this very important stakeholder group. And again, I would have to say that the biggest exposure in crisis management is missing, again, a key stakeholder group and understanding how they'll be impacted. So those are really the highlights of how we manage the crisis. I'll tell you that in our experience, typically the event doesn't become a crisis until people start talking about it. And it's the way they communicate about the event is what brings it to the crisis level. That's when people start to get angry or outraged, when they hear how one communicates about the event. I mean, the classic one I'll use when the explosion, BP, the CEO made a comment after days of, again, being in that state of fatigue, I just want my life back. And if you can imagine what how that was received by the families who had actually lost loved ones and had others who were injured. So saying, unfortunately, stupid things in the moment can have a tremendous backlash. So this all turns now to how do we make sure we don't do that? What do we need to have in place to effectively communicate? We need to identify who are our spokespersons, not just, with all due respect to elected officials and people with senior titles. You may not be the best spokesperson for your organization. There may be someone who could do a better job. Now, some of you may have PIOs, public information officers. The smaller municipalities and public entities do not. So identifying who you think would be able to stick to a script, stick to a strategy, that person may be the most effective. Now, depending on the magnitude of the event, it may absolutely be critical that the most senior official ultimately speak. But that comes with a lot of preparation before doing so. It shouldn't be off the cuff. Identifying your stakeholder groups, we talked about that. Message maps, so there's three things here: message maps, home bases, and holding statements. And let me just quickly go over each. Holding statement is something that we see as having value that you would issue immediately when something happens, when you don't yet know much. It's something you would do that typically tells people, we're aware this occurred, we're investigating, we're taking it seriously. The home base is more a themed type of approach to messaging. So if any of you have ever been a witness in a deposition, you may remember when you got prepped that, particularly if you were a defendant, there were certain safe things you could say no matter what type of a question you were asked. So we call those home bases. And a home base, you may be asked a question that how could you have allowed one of your officers to exert this type of force upon one of our citizens? And the answer, you're never going to answer a question like that, right? The answer would be something like, the safety of each of our citizens is our highest priority. And we have policies and procedures in place, blah, blah, blah. So those are home bases that give you the ability to say something important, but not get yourself into trouble by delving into a fact pattern or a question that you don't even know if it's accurate. And finally, message maps are the very detailed types of communications that you would prepare ahead of time. So for example, a message map might be, when did you learn, the question might be, if you anticipate, when did you learn that a victim had come forward alleging sexual harassment? So any type of question that's very detailed about certain facts, you would want to have message maps written. And it might be something as simple as I'm sure you can appreciate, we cannot discuss pending litigation. Let's say it was something that was already filed. Or as I'm sure you can appreciate, we cannot discuss any matters that are under investigation. But that would be an example of a message map. And those are very important, and those are something that each of you could really do now for those top threats that you've either confronted in the past or you will confront again in the future, or you expect could happen to you. Having that type of preparation will save you a tremendous amount of mistakes down the road. And we also say it's easier to edit than create. So you might craft something today, it gets you 80% of the way there, and when the fact situation evolves, you get to refine the message to make it more suited for the specifics. Monitoring merged media, talked about that a little earlier. That would be monitoring social media and traditional media for postings and sentiment. There are tools that actually can tell you that out of the 1,200 tweets that related to a certain event, 80% of them were favorable toward your municipality and 20% were neutral, and the rest were negative. So having a tool that can help you evaluate sentiment is very important, because that's how you're going to also determine whether or not your communication strategy is working. Is it effective? Are people responding well to it? So it's also important that you monitor the media for that reason. The rule of tens, we always throw that out there to say that, for example, let's use a town meeting, which you'll see as one of the crisis traps, that we really don't recommend town meetings in the aftermath of a crisis. But usually, out of the 100% of the people, there'll be 10 that are there really just to want to make your life miserable. And out of those 10, there'll be another 10% that will continue to do it long past when others have moved on to the next issue. And unfortunately, we often continue to engage with that 10% when we shouldn't. So I just want to call that to your attention to make sure that when you feel you need to issue a statement, ask yourself, well, how many people called our office and complained about something? Because you might get the message, well, such and such complained and it sounded terrible. Okay, and then a day later, well, how many more? Oh, well, there haven't been any more. Okay, so maybe this thing is dying out and I don't really need to go out there and say something. Or one-on-one. I mean, don't forget the traditional old-fashioned way of communicating. Pick up the phone sometimes and call that one person who's making all the noise. See if you can address their concerns. You're going to learn very quickly whether they are just the type of person that is looking to make your life hell, or they are the type of person that just is really concerned about an answer, and once you give it to them, they're satisfied. Or, maybe not. Maybe you have some more work to do, but at least you'll know. So that's, the basics on crisis communications, which really leads to where most of the traps take place, or where they can be found. Many times we deal with the media in a very positive way. Our organization may do something really great for its citizens, and we want the press coverage. And many of us are used to being in front of the press when we're campaigning, and we recognize that that's part of what we need to do. Unfortunately, once something bad has happened, and again, you're back to the ABCs, the anger, the blame, the concern, the focus of the media is very different at that point. They are not your friend at that point, even if they are your friend at another time. It might even be someone you socially have a connection to, but they have a job to do when something bad happens, and they want to sell papers or clicks, whatever. So they're fueled by controversy. They're not fueled by the truth or the facts. And today, unfortunately, it's more about entertainment than true news. We often see that people think they can puff their way through, that, I'm really smart and I'm going to tell you what I want to be true. I'm going to make it sound really compelling, and I'm going to explain to you why what you're hearing about isn't so bad. Unfortunately, that doesn't work either. Explaining is losing. That's a saying we have. And I'll call it to your attention the next time you're even engaged in a conversation with your children or your grandchildren, and you find them explaining why they hit their brother, or why they didn't do their homework, or why they, let the dog out when they shouldn't have. They'll be explaining, and you'll see your reaction to that. You immediately shut down. It's like, I don't care why it happened. Tell me why it's not going to happen again. Tell me that you learned something. So there is no amount of explaining you can do in the aftermath of a serious event. Someone's hurt, someone's killed, someone was, sexually assaulted, someone was discriminated against. There is nothing you can say to explain that away. So if you ever find yourself in that mode where you try to, stop. It just doesn't work. Be focused in your messaging. Often there are leaders that will want to be seen in the aftermath of an event because they want people to recognize the value they are bringing to the situation. And let's face it, there might also be this undercurrent of, hey, I'm going to be running at some point again, and let me get out there. If you're going to do that, it has to be very carefully done, because people are smart and they recognize ulterior motives. So if you're going to go in front of the public after something terrible has happened, you have to be extremely focused in the messaging you're giving. And the messaging really needs to always tie back to those that were harmed. Our thoughts and prayers are with the people who've been impacted. The safety of our citizens is our highest priority. We are conducting an investigation to determine what occurred. We practice continuous improvement. We will learn from what happened. Messaging like that is fine, but recognize that the situation will always be a tricky one for you if you decide to go out there after something's happened. That's terrible. Press conferences, again, same point, not an opportunity for a stump speech. I will also say that one of the crisis traps we see often is that officials will talk about the facts that happened instead of the police. If the police are involved in an investigation and there's a press conference, let the police talk about what happened. Because invariably, if you do, it will be wrong. You may not have thought it was wrong at the time, but what we say is that the facts we learn in the first 24 hours are often wrong. So recognize that, and recognize that you're taking a risk if you try to opine on the facts, say, that, for example, let's say it is a sexual harassment thing. No, it's never been brought to our attention that this person was a problem. You know what? You're going to find out that it was. You may not have known about it. They might have reported it to a different employee in your organization, but rest assured, statements that are definitive come back to haunt you. So we strongly urge you to be very careful, and again, recognize your role in a press conference and let the police do, their role. And the mic is never off. I'm sure you've heard or read about situations where public officials have spoken, in a public meeting where they thought the microphone was off and it wasn't. And unfortunate things are heard. Well, first of all, unfortunate things are said that shouldn't be said to begin with. And then they are, of course, now heard by the public. So one of the media traps, this happened to a client of mine literally 2 days ago. I changed the facts, but you'll get the point. This was an email that he got from a reporter. I understand your organization's been served with a civil suit alleging excessive use of force. Officer Jones is accused of harming the plaintiff with a taser. We're reaching out to you for a statement. If we don't hear from you by 3 o'clock, we'll publish the story we have. Thanks so much. So invariably, most people see this, and again, they panic, and they feel like, well, wow, we better get back to them. The reality is that you're probably better off letting them run with what they have, which if they're calling you and saying this, they don't have your side. They don't have anything. Yes, could they go public with one side of the story? They could, and they often do. And the worst thing it's going to say is that, Jim Smith didn't return our phone call. That's really all they can say. If you do call them, even if it's to say that the matter is under investigation, they can say, we spoke with Jim Smith. And then they go on to write the story they want to write, and it looks like they're attributing things to you that you never said. So again, interaction with the media after something has happened has to be very deliberate, very planned. And again, those are the kinds of things that we can help with if you reach out, if there's a situation. So a few more. I mentioned the town hall meeting. We think those are usually a bad idea. That said, if you're going to do it and we can't talk you out of it, then we'll at least try to help you prep for it and train people on how they should react in a meeting like that. We talked about let the police be the police, achieving a balance between making the populace feel protected while being respectful to those injured. So this is something we understand weighs heavy on all of you. For those of you who you're charged, that's your role. You're charged with not just making them feel protected, but with actual protection in some ways. So I think there's a balance you can strike that will enable people to feel safe, but also being very respectful for those who've been injured. And if it's done properly, everyone can look good in that example. I referenced this a little bit earlier, but again, it will anything you try to explain, any words you try to use to characterize the magnitude of what happened to a victim won't be enough. So, for example, we are devastated by the loss of this precious child, or words where you try to use adjectives to describe someone will never meet up to what the family would have used. We are saddened. We often see things like, we are saddened by the events that occurred. With all due respect, it's not about you. It's about those that were harmed. So pronouns like we, if you're starting to write something like that, I would not do that. We'd recommend that instead, our thoughts and prayers are with the victim and their family. Don't make it about you, make it about them, because at the end of the day, that's who you need to care for. You need to care for the victims and those that have been impacted. Another thing that's also important that may not be obvious is that if there are interpersonal risks that exist between people within your organization, they get heightened in a crisis. People who don't get along, it gets worse when the lens is turned on all of them. So I think it's something to recognize, to be aware of, and when it can be avoided, where, for example, there are two people that you already know have a problem with one another, don't expect them to collaborate and work well when they're really under pressure. That's something that you can control through the crisis management process. So back to the consequence management piece. The crisis is short-lived. The consequences can last forever. And some of you who may have heard me speak before, if I've used this image, I always ask the audience the question of, do we know what this is? And it's the state flower of Colorado. And I'll ask, do you know the name of the flower? And typically people don't. But the name of the flower is columbine. And of course, that word now doesn't have the same meaning as it ever did. So the consequences can last forever, as evidenced by that example. So how do we really manage the consequences? What are the priorities that we need to focus on? Absolutely 100% people first. And we need to do it really quickly. People need to feel supported, and oftentimes we'll get pulled into something a week or two after an event has occurred. And I'm not just talking about things like shootings. You could have, it could be any type of an event where people experienced fear. They may have witnessed something horrific. It might have been your employees who witnessed something. People need, one of the terms is psychological first aid. People need to meet with counselors or professionals or even citizens who go through the type of training. Psychological first aid is something that anyone can be trained on. And it's important because what it does is it helps triage the needs of the victims and their families when something happens. And if you have, for example, an employee who claims they were a victim of harassment or something like that, that person needs attention. That person deserves attention. And that is how you're going to bring the anger level down of that person, and how you might prevent even a lawsuit or something from becoming a crisis. If you do right by the people that are impacted, the likelihood is that you won't suffer the same brand and reputation impact than if you don't. Now, it doesn't mean you might not get sued. It doesn't mean you might not pay a settlement. You might do all of those things, but it will be much more tolerable, the amount, the process, everything, if at least people feel like you treated them decently. So that's the most important thing. Same thing with their families. So understanding that families have needs, that there may, depending on the scale of the event, you may need a call center, you may need. If you ever send someone to the hospital, we always recommend that there be a hospital liaison from your organization, from, that's present there, that can help the families. Crisis circles are the term we use to describe the levels of impact. The people who were closest to what occurred are going to have greater needs than the people who were further removed. So I think, that's pretty logical. Karen, you may want to jump in on this point about notifying your risk manager at the earliest possible moment.
Well, if it's a crisis, I would say to notify CrisisRisk for something like that, unless it's something on a smaller scale that they might need NYMER's risk management assistance with.
Okay. And Karen will give you the ability to do that. But I think also most of you, or some of you, I know also have risk managers, and those risk managers have likely been trained as to, the process. But I will tell you that, again, it's back to circumstance versus claim. The earlier you can get on something, the better the outcome's going to be. And again, you might even prevent something from happening. Notifying legal counsel early, that's important because you want to try to cloak attorney-client privilege around whatever you're going to be doing next. So that inures to your benefit down the road. Investigation. One of the other, crisis traps we see is that some investigations are conducted internally and then they're perceived to be a cover-up for what occurred. So you might want to consider utilizing, for example, in New York, the state police have the Bureau of Criminal Investigation, where you would turn over the information to them, direct the media to them. If you have a situation where it's a he said, she said type of interaction with a public official, some have been in the news lately in New York State, we highly recommend that you have a third party do the investigation so you don't eventually be accused of having covered up anything. Monitoring social media, as we talked about before, is also going to be what enables you to protect, to understand the impacts to your brand and reputation and make sure that you are effective in your communications, and then you can adjust them accordingly. Again, back to that sentiment. Okay, so to bring this toward the end here, I want to just touch on the registration questions we were asked and give you guys the results. So we had asked whether or not you have a crisis management plan that designates a multidisciplinary team that you can use in the aftermath of an event that threatens your critical assets. So a documented plan and a multidisciplinary team. The reason we say multidisciplinary team is because having the varied perspectives that sit around a table to try to solve a problem, address a challenge, the outcome will be better. So having representation that from your risk management, from it may be if it's an issue involving any criminal activity, having someone from law enforcement, having someone from IT if it's a cyber event, having someone from your legislature or your whatever your form of government is, your mayor, whatever. So in other words, trying to bring this multidisciplinary approach to determining the steps that need to be taken and acting on them. So here we see that 34% of you said you do have a documented plan with a designated team, and that's excellent. Some of you have something in between, and the balance do not. So obviously, for those of you who don't, we recognize a program like this can't be implemented overnight. We say it's a process of continuous improvement. So you got to start somewhere. So I think that's something you can, talk to NYMER about, and Karen and her team and people who can give you some guidance, and we certainly, would be happy to as well. The second question then is, if you have a plan, has it been tested in the last 12 months? And this number probably bothers me more than anything else, because if we don't test our plans, we don't know if they work. And then they truly are that proverbial notebook that sits on the shelf. Now, you might test them through real life events. That counts. Hopefully you find out what you were doing works, and if it doesn't, you can adjust your plan accordingly. But testing is really doing tabletops, bringing people around the table and simulating a set of facts and having them unfold where people are asked to make decisions is the best way to figure out. It's the best way to train people. It's the best way to determine whether the plan you've written is effective. Have we included all the stakeholder groups we need? Did we think about everybody? So I can't emphasize enough the importance of at least an annual tabletop exercise for your crisis management team. And I want to leave you with this last idea. This is something we're doing in other states with counties where we had recommended that every municipality designates someone, a crisis coordinator in their county, in their municipality. And their role is really to recognize that a situation may escalate to a crisis, and it's their role to coordinate with leadership to make sure the team gets pulled together, to make sure those checklists and plans are sitting on the table and that they're going to go through them and that make sure we don't miss something. We would train, these people would get trained on what are the triggers that require escalation, what are the cues? How do we, for example, now with coronavirus, hopefully you have sat down and determined what are the triggers that might lead you to say we're going to close City Hall, or we're going to ask people to work from home, or we're closing schools, or whatever it may be. You need to identify triggers that as it relates to these key threats so you know when to act. And if you had someone whose job it was to think about crisis and think about your coordinating your overall crisis program, that person could spend some time on that. Again, that person would also ideally understand the whole why media, why do we talk to the media, when should we, when shouldn't we, and protect all of you from mistakes that are unfortunate, things that just don't have to go wrong. And avoid late notice and hopefully decrease frequency and severity and prevent harm to your people, your brand, your reputation. So in effect, really like what we're saying is, let's see if I went going the wrong way. We want, I guess they become the meerkat. The profile of a person would be someone who's got a lot of experience in your organization, someone who knows the issues that are local. They can make decisions, they observe confidentiality, follow instructions, they're a good performer, attention to detail, good communicator, and they'd be committed to the role. So it's something that if you have an interest in, we'd be happy to talk to you about that. So I think, Karen, I'm sorry I took us really close to the edge here with just a few minutes left. So
that's fine. I didn't see any questions come through. Either they're quiet or they're hungry if they're not eating at their desk. But feel free to reach out to Suzanne or to me. I think my contact information is also on the next screen, so you can get the crisis risk information that's available to you or those services available to you as a NYMER member. I can't thank you, Suzanne Laughlin, enough for spending your time on this very important topic, and certainly your experience and knowledge bring a lot to the subject. One thing, key point yeah.
No, Karen, sorry. I want to apologize. I see, I'm looking through there are actually a couple of questions.
Oh, good, good. Let's answer.
I'm sorry that I didn't see that. Well, a couple of people had audio issues, and I really hope that was limited. I'm sorry if there shouldn't have been a need for a pin for the audio. And if hopefully you got that resolved, and if not, I absolutely, apologize for that, and we'll try to figure out what happened. Karen, they are asking for more information about the hotline, what the number is. Will the slides be available? Yes, we're happy. We'll give Karen the slides, and she could share those if you reach out to Karen. There is one I want to clarify. Someone has indicated one slide said something about replying to social media posts. I don't remember exactly what I said there, but I want to be very, if I did say something that was confusing, I want to set it straight now. What I think is vital is the monitoring of social media posts. As far as what you reply to, how, when, that is not so simple. That really depends on what was said, who said it, what kind of reach that person has. So that's really a case-by-case situation. I'm happy to have a follow-up conversation with anyone if they have a question about that. And I think that was the last question, Karen. I'm just going through them real quickly. Yes. Okay, so sorry to interrupt you.
No, don't be silly. That was important to get the questions that people had answered. I want to let everybody know, too, important, this webinar will be recorded and it will be available on the NYMER website. So if you would like to share it with others at your municipality, please do that. It won't be right away, probably within the next week. And I think the biggest point that you hit home on is that as a municipality, your actions really do matter because everybody is watching. So mitigating the circumstances can avoid a claim, further damages, or absolutely your reputational damage, which is very important. And thank you so much again, Suzanne. You have a great day.
Thanks for asking me.
Yeah, no, thanks. And I guess we can end the webinar.
And let everybody go have lunch. Okay. Take care, everybody.
Thanks again.
Thank you so much.
Great job.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.